So this is our second webinar of this series. The first was very much focused on the why become a menopause-friendly employer, and this session is more practical, focusing on the how. So to introduce myself, I'm Emma Hammond, an employment partner with gunnercooke, and here at gunnercooke we are encouraged to give back, and that from a sort of lawyer perspective is around having a pro bono element to your practice. And mine is around helping women with menopause related issues in the workplace, where otherwise they wouldn't be able to access legal support. I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague Angela Brumpton, who is a fellow employment lawyer. Angela is passionate about training and very accomplished at it, and is also well known for being engaged in very high profile employment tribunal cases, often covered in the national press. After Angela's spoken today, we have our guest speaker, Emma of HÄLSA. Emma set up a business called HÄLSA Wellbeing in 2010 in Harrogate. And Emma has the advantage of having had a senior HR career in advance of setting up the business, so very well understands the challenges that HR and businesses have in setting up wellbeing services and support for their people. Emma's business is founded on 4 principles, which is eat well, feel well, sleep well, and think well. And that underpins the delivery of her services, both online and in person, in corporate and clinical settings. And today, Emma's focus will again be on the practical, whilst Angela will cover off policy content, breaking down the stigma, and the very important aspect of educating people within the initiatives. Emma will also focus on the benefits to the business of assisting not just women in transition, but also the whole of the workforce by setting up these sorts of initiatives and being menopause friendly. After all, we're looking at benefits as Jo discussed in webinar 1, which is reducing litigation risk, which is also reducing the number of women of this age and stage from leaving the workforce, and also, of course, attracting people who may at this age and stage be looking for work. Certainly I know I'm in that space at the moment, and if I were looking to leave gunnercooke, which of course I'm not, I would absolutely be attracted by an employer that was pushing this initiative, that was openly discussing being menopause friendly. And so there are so many business benefits, and we'll be covering those off today. Before I hand over to our speakers, Helen is going to post a poll for you and explain how to engage with that poll, and then Angela will talk through the results. Thank you very much for listening.
So the poll should be on your screen now. If you could select your answers, we will share the results in a second. Lovely, and the results should be on your screen now.
Okay, so 42% of women have considered leaving work due to the menopause. So if you think about your workforce and how many women of menopausal age there are there, that is potentially an awful lot of the workforce who are unhappy or struggling at work for some reason. So with that figure in mind, let's look at what we can do about it. So what impact we can make and what changes we can make in our workplaces. So at our last session, Jo went through the legal imperatives for addressing menopause and raising awareness, including the potential penalties for employers if this is not done. So what I want to focus on today is the question of, well, what can we do? What exactly can we do to create a menopause-friendly environment which will support your staff to thrive, but will also help to reduce any of these legal risks as far as possible? Educating your workforce is absolutely key. So I want to look at what that means, how you can educate your workforce and practical ways to get that done. I'll take you through what goes into a good menopause policy, and I will also look at what you can reasonably do to support workers who are suffering the symptoms and effects of menopause. So my aim today is for this to be a really practical session, and at the end of it you go away with some tips and ideas for action. Next slide, please, Helen. So how to educate your workforce? Creating a culture of openness is absolutely key, I think, to the success of any menopause campaign you launch, because let's face it, talking openly about menopause at work has been pretty unthinkable. I would think that would be fair to say, up to very recently. I don't know anybody who would have said before relatively recently that they were totally comfortable raising the issues of menopause in the workplace. So how do you do this? How do you create this culture of openness? And in my opinion, I think, as is usually the case, this ideally needs to come from the top. So your challenge is to get members of your senior leadership on board to start a menopause campaign. Can you get them to be vocal and visible in their support for this as a policy? And can you persuade them and also encourage them to persuade others that this is important to the overall health, not just of individual staff members, but the business as a whole? Creating menopause champions or ambassadors is a really good idea. So the role of a menopause champion would be voluntary. I think the most important characteristics of a champion is that they are really enthusiastic about helping women. They don't necessarily have to have direct experience of menopause themselves, but they must be very comfortable talking about it. So what would a menopause champion do? I think this is going to vary depending on your organisation and what you want to achieve. But in general, they would be responsible for raising the profile of menopause and the support that your organisation offers. They can arrange workshops, they can help create social networks or support networks within the business. They can direct colleagues to support and advice, which I think is really important. They can liaise with senior management on providing appropriate support. So ultimately being responsible for getting the senior leadership on board. They can help you roll out your new menopause policy, so more on your new menopause policy later. And they can help you keep up to date with issues in relation to menopause generally. How many you need will depend on the size of your business. But again, I think having senior leadership team members, at least some of them taking up some of those ambassadorial roles, I think would be a good idea. But ultimately, you can ask for volunteers from all parts of your business. As Emma mentioned in the introduction, I am a huge fan of training in business generally. I think as well as educating and helping to raise awareness, training does help to raise your employees' confidence, which really helps when it helps them to identify issues and it helps them to address them as well. It gives them the confidence to tackle them. And I think this ultimately keeps you out of trouble as a business. So what I mean by trouble is it can avoid issues becoming resignations, and ultimately it can avoid them ending up as employment tribunal claims. So I think it's absolutely key. Depending on the nature of your workforce, you could make any training role specific. So for example, someone who manages the shop floor may need to be more aware of environmental factors, whereas someone in a more senior office role, for example, may need to be a little bit more aware of job functions. One option is for you to train your menopause champions first. Once you've trained them, you can then use them to roll out training to your line managers across the business. So this is just an option. You may prefer to just roll out training to all managers at once and then just use your champions for ongoing campaigns. But it's an option. Have a think about what you think would work for you. I mentioned in the slide, if you have existing social networks at work, then use these to disseminate information. Another idea, which Emma will also touch on after me, so I'll only mention it briefly, is you could start your own social group and encourage those who are interested to attend. I remember years ago, a client of mine launched an initiative whereby women returning from maternity leave could join a social group where they could make connections with other new parents at work who are ultimately going through the same or similar experiences. I'm told it was really popular, particularly as there was a lunch budget to go with it. So there's a top tip. If you want to get attendance at an event, I do find throwing in lunch often helps with that attendance. But I think the real value is to acknowledge new parents and show them that they were in fact welcome in the workplace. And I think that's an important message. Next slide, please, Helen. A good time to launch any campaign is to piggyback on events that are already happening at a national or an international level. And I've made a few suggestions here. We've just had International Women's Day, but coming up later in the year, we've got Women's Health Week, which is in May, the 8th to the 14th. And we've also got World Menopause Day on the 18th of October. Just incidentally, when I was looking at the web pages for World Menopause Day, there were some really interesting facts I found on there, such as some of the different and really awful treatments that they used to use to treat menopausal symptoms in the past, which in the 1800s included giving women cannabis and opium. And then they wondered why they treated women for histrionics, as they called it. You can also look at what other employers are currently doing for inspiration. And I think that's a really good idea because, you know, going out and looking at what your peers are doing, looking at what they've already tried and what works and what doesn't work, I think that's a really good starting point. So I'll mention HSBC first. So their initiative includes training 50 menopause advocates and 75 champions, made up of colleagues of all genders. Menopause advocates and champions deliver training and awareness sessions, support and information to other managers and colleagues. I'm not sure what the difference is between an advocate and a champion in their business, but there is an awful lot of them. So 50 advocates and 75 champions, but of course they will have an awful lot of staff to train. So you perhaps may not need that many or anything like that many. They hold weekly lunch and learn sessions open to all colleagues, providing connection, education and exercise. Again, a great idea. If you think a weekly session is too much, you could do a fortnightly session or even a monthly session, whatever works for you. I'm told the sessions cover a wide range of topics, from fitness and how to deal with brain fog and hot flashes, to more taboo topics such as libido and anxiety coping strategies. So a really open forum for staff there. They launched a menopause page on the Employee Wellbeing Hub, which had a range of resources such as fact sheets and guides for managers. I think this could be a really, relatively easy win for you at an early stage. Providing a fact sheet isn't particularly cost or labour intensive, and could actually be really useful. So again, a good starting point. They redesigned the HSBC uniform to ensure it's made out of more breathable material, and they made it so women can order more sets of uniform without necessarily having to give a reason for doing that. Channel 4 say that their menopause policy will support women experiencing menopausal symptoms and give them access to flexible working arrangements and paid leave if they feel unwell. It will also offer employees a private, cool and quiet workspace and what they term a working environment assessment to ensure their physical workspace is not worsening their symptoms. So I think that's a good initiative. Menopause awareness briefings will be given to the company's leadership teams, and its HR team now has a dedicated menopause champion. Again, another relatively easy win, but something that I think will be really useful. If you're lucky enough to have a HR team, find a volunteer on that team to be your HR menopause champion. They can then act as a source of information for HR generally, which can then be disseminated down to the business. But there'll also be potentially a point of focus, a point of contact for the business generally, which I think is really important. So again, a relatively easy win that. And I'm all about that. I'm all about making things really simple so you can get them done quickly. Vodafone, in 2021, they actually made their menopause toolkit available for download. So after this session, you can go and Google Vodafone and their menopause toolkit and go and have a look and see what they do. Apparently it was originally only available to managers to help them support employees, but then they made it available to everybody so employees can access it as well. And last but not least, ASOS offers staff flexible work and paid leave during menopause. I mention them because the fertility treatment, pregnancy loss and other health and life challenges are also covered in their support policy. So I think if we can get, if you can find out what they're doing and get your hands on that, then that would be worth checking out. Next slide, please, Helen. So can I ask Helen to do our next poll, please? I'd just be interested to know what the answers are to this before we move on. Do you think your managers are currently able to have confident and sensitive conversations with your staff about menopause? If you wouldn't mind popping your answer down, and then we'll have a look at the result. Yes, 29%, that's not a bad figure actually. No, 43%, and 29% not sure. That was probably really what we were expecting. I think there's a difference between managers being incapable of doing it. I think many of your managers are capable of doing it, but they may not yet have the confidence, and they may not yet understand how to do it in a proper way. I think it's worth looking at some of the preconceptions and assumptions that are around menopause, because when you're training your champions and your line management, you want them to be able to have really sensitive conversations, and you want them to have productive conversations and to be confident in having those. So some of these assumptions need to be addressed, such as when women are likely to be menopausal. So the average age for menopause apparently is 52, but actually it can start anywhere from your 30s to your early 60s. So making assumptions about when women are going to experience this isn't really helpful. Also, purely with my lawyer's hat on, it is equally risky from a discriminatory point of view to simply assume that the behaviour or symptoms of women of a certain age are menopause related. Of course, some women have no symptoms or very few symptoms. So that is another good reason to train staff to have sensitive conversations rather than ones which potentially can have more harm, can cause more harm than good. Another preconception, just to touch on here, I know we've touched on it in our last session, so I won't labour it, but of course it's not just all about hot flushes or brain fog. There are between 30 and 100 known symptoms of menopause, so that's something everybody needs to be aware of. It's not that bad. Of course, for some women it isn't that bad, but for some women symptoms can be very severe. And another thing I've heard, and I've heard it together, is it only lasts a few years. So I've heard somebody actually say, well, it's not that bad and it only lasts a couple of years. So why are we bothering to put in place lots of policies and put a lot of effort into this when it's not really going to be that big of an issue? Perimenopause and postmenopause can last up to 10 years and beyond. So again, it's just really good idea to train your staff, make them aware of some of these misconceptions and make sure that when they're having these conversations with staff, even if they're well-meaning, that they are in fact effective and not potentially going to cause more trouble. Okay, next slide. Okay, policies and procedures. I thought it'd be worth just looking at what a good policy should contain. And of course, your policy should underpin everything else you're doing in the workplace. So it needs to give details about what the menopause is, which of course is to educate people. And it should ideally express why having a policy is relevant to the workforce as a whole. I think this is particularly important when it comes to a menopause policy, because not everyone in your organisation is going to think this is remotely relevant to them. And I think just from a profile raising perspective and also an understanding perspective, it would be a good idea to at least try to educate people as to why it is relevant and why it's important. State what help and support can be accessed. So things like risk assessments and adjustments. If somebody picks up your policy and they're struggling, they will immediately be able to say, well, actually, there is some help I can access and this is what it looks like. It should signpost to other support if that is available also. So some of you might have the benefit of an employee helpline or access to counselling services. All of these things may be relevant to somebody picking up that menopause policy. Acknowledge the importance of creating an open environment. So I think that acknowledging the importance of being able to speak out about this is a really important feature, because when you roll this policy out, there will be women in your workforce who will not be convinced that this is actually something they're free to talk about. They'll either be embarrassed or they could potentially be scared of sharing anything which can be construed as a weakness. This may be more true for women who occupy more senior positions. So I think that stressing that discussions about menopause will be welcome rather than taboo. It's important that that is expressly stated. Of course, we've got to follow that up with action as well. But I do think that it's a good start to have that in the policy. Suggest a point of contact for concerns and how any concerns will be handled. And this might be where your HR menopause champion might come in. And stress an obligation for staff to support those experiencing the menopause and provide details of any adjustments. So details of the types of adjustments that can be considered. One thing to just bear in mind here is, as with any illness that could potentially be a disability, each case is unique and there's certainly no one size fits all approach to menopause. However, what you could do is give examples of the types of adjustment the business might consider. So things like flexible working or changes to the work environment. Again, it's just giving those who pick up the policy a flavour of what they might expect if they do ask for help. Next slide, please, Helen. Okay, so my main frustration with policies is that when a company has an issue with something and you ask to see their policy, it turns out that they have a perfectly good one. Sometimes they've got a perfectly good one that I've actually drafted for them. But it's been sat on a dusty shelf and no one's actually seen this policy. No one knows where it is or what became of it. So ensure that staff are given a copy. I know it sounds really basic, but it's important. Ensure they're given a copy or know that one is available and they know where to find it. So for example, if you have an intranet, pop it on the internet where it's easily accessible. And then you can use your menopause awareness campaign to make people aware that there is a policy there. You can also consider providing it to staff on induction along with all of your other policies. So particularly in the early stages when you're trying to drive awareness of this policy, providing it to all new staff will set the tone in terms of how you view it. I think somebody's come off mute. What do I mean by it intersects with other workplace policies? So menopause and its symptoms and effects may be relevant to your absence management policy, for example, and it may be relevant to your performance policy. It is very likely to be relevant to your flexible working policy, as flexible working is a potential adjustment. It is certainly relevant to equal opportunities, and obviously you'll be aware, or you should be aware, that any information about an employee's health is considered sensitive special category data and needs to be processed in a certain way. So you need to be aware of those. You need to be aware of those other interactions with other policies, and a really good menopause policy will flag that. What you don't need to do, in my opinion, is to go away and amend all of your other policies now. At the moment, menopause is not a disability or a deemed disability. It isn't a protected characteristic. It may constitute a disability if the symptoms are severe enough, which is the case with many, many other conditions. So there's therefore no need to specifically mention menopause in your other policies, provided that there is sufficient awareness as to how it may be relevant. Of course, you are free, if you want to mention it in your other policies if you wish, but it isn't mandatory. I think my advice at the moment would be to focus on getting your menopause policy ready and focus on getting your awareness campaign out there. If you provide training to your staff on things like performance management or managing illness, which I of course encourage you to do regularly, then it can be mentioned and included there to raise that awareness. But I think if you're just starting out with addressing menopause in the workplace, I think you've probably got enough to do at the moment. So stick to focusing on those matters. Next slide, please, Helen. Okay, so where do I start? This is a slide is just really a summary then of how you can get your menopause campaign off the ground. So start with training. Think about who you're going to train. Are you going to train all your managers, or are you going to train your champions and then have them sort of disseminate it down in the business? What is your training going to include? It should include being aware of symptoms, being aware of preconceptions and assumptions, and should include some guidance and support in how to have conversations in a way that has the desired effect. And of course, it needs to include where individuals can get support. Have a think about how you're going to raise awareness of your campaign. Are you going to do a newsletter to start with? Are you going to put information on wellbeing hubs? You could advertise lunch and learn sessions. Can you get your leadership team to lead discussions? I think sessions which are led by more senior people in the business tend to be better attended. So after this session, go away and consider what your plan is to get started, and then diarise when and how those things are going to happen. My advice generally would be start with the simple things, start with the things you can quickly, readily and easily do, and have a plan for providing the rest. Next slide, please, Helen. So here's some tips on how to support workers. These are just some ideas to get you started. You could follow in HSBC's footsteps and redesign your uniforms if you have them. And then you can look at your workplace facilities. So workplace temperature, I think workplace temperature is and always has been a minefield in the workplace. But provision of electric fans could be a relatively easy start. Flexible working and home working is common really now across many businesses. And so I think this is one of those areas that is eminently doable for many businesses, and certainly much more doable than it used to be. Changes to work allocation may be more tricky, and they will certainly require more close management, but I think they're very much on the agenda. And just bear in mind that workplace adjustments are and should be regularly reviewed to ensure they remain relevant and effective. So these changes don't necessarily have to stay in place forever. Sometimes we are looking at short-term fixes to get our individuals, our staff members through some difficult times. And then we can do look at other things such as more frequent rest breaks. I think that's an interesting one to look at, which actually may be very helpful. But again, these adjustments are going to be very, very specific to each individual person and what you can achieve in your business. Okay, next slide, please. So finally, this is my last slide, and I just would like to end it by saying we need to break the stigma. You will only get engagement in a menopause policy and a menopause campaign if it becomes okay to say. Some of you may know that Nicola Sturgeon, who is 51, went on Loose Women last week and talked about the menopause. And she talked about how she felt nervous to speak out about what she described as an intensely personal experience. She said that she hoped that hair addressing the issue would help her to tackle the stigma around it, but that she had been worried about how she was going to cope, given the fact that her role is so public. One of the more interesting things she said, for me anyway, was she said she would have loved to have been able to pick up a book and read about some other senior female politicians who'd gone through menopause whilst, you know, working at that sort of very high profile and public level. But there isn't anything out there. There's very little information, so she wasn't able to sort of share experience or read about it. And that got me to thinking, you know, actually I can't think of any senior woman in politics, any senior political figure who's discussed menopause and the impact on them, which harkens back to my earlier comment that in fact it might be your most senior staff in key positions doing something really useful and important for you, who are actually most reluctant to talk about menopause and therefore the least likely to seek help, and maybe more likely to fall into those categories of person who are actually considering giving up because they're struggling. So let's break the stigma. Remember, ultimately, this is about looking after your staff and retaining your talent. It's really that simple. We want to make sure that we don't hemorrhage our best talent. And, you know, also in these sensitive times, if you're struggling to persuade the business that this is a matter worth addressing, then there is a risk to reputation, as Emma mentioned, and losing talent may be the thing that swings it for them. So losing the talent they have and being unable to attract the talent they want. Okay, so if anybody has any questions for me that they don't have a chance to get asked and answered on this session, then please feel free to drop me a line afterwards. But otherwise, thank you for listening, and I'll hand back over to Emma.
Thanks, Angela. Emma, thanks for the introduction earlier, and hello and welcome to everybody on the call today. I am Emma from HÄLSA Wellbeing, and following on from Angela, what I would like to share with you today are some really simple ideas around being menopause friendly in terms of implementing support programs to staff. So we're going to look at what to consider, how to potentially build a program, and some examples of what this can look like, as well as some really low cost or even no cost options for providing support to staff. Now, as Emma mentioned, prior to setting up HÄLSA Wellbeing, I worked in HR, so I completely understand the challenges that you can face when wanting to implement wellbeing services. The intention was, in my case anyway, the intention was always there, but time and budget constraints and general work pressures and resource limitations often got in the way for me. So I hope that today gives you some ideas around potential starting points for looking at menopause programs in the workplace. I will talk in more detail about some example models, but what I would like to share before I do that are my 3 top tips for your starting point. So the first one is to set the scene well and build a really strong foundation. So for those of you who attended webinar 1, you looked at menopause, the impact, and I just want to reference that again because it's really key to focus on the wider legal, business, demographic and social responsibility aspects when putting your structure in place. Now, Angela talked earlier about policies and procedures, and I would highly recommend that you look at implementing a menopause policy, even if it's just a basic one. It's proven that when workplaces have a menopause policy in place, absenteeism, and perhaps more importantly, presenteeism, can be greatly impacted, and staff can feel a greater confidence because they're shown that all employees are equal in their importance to the business. So make menopause part of your diversity and your inclusivity focus. Secondly, keep it really simple and also listen to staff feedback. Don't make things complicated. Angela mentioned this before as well, to start small and build from there, and I would certainly agree with that. And continually evaluate so that you're constantly listening to your staff and you're shaping your wellbeing services and support. Ladies often report to us that they just can't even navigate a simple instruction leaflet. So I think that simplicity in any programs that you implement is key. And finally, link it back. Ensure that whatever you are implementing is linked back to internal support that you already have, and more importantly, signposting. I find that this is often missed in organisations, but it's actually a great opportunity to link support back to what is already in place. Next slide, Helen, please. So a really good starting point for planning and building a menopause programme is to think of it in 3 layers. The first part is what I call the essentials. So for example, you may want to put on a very basic webinar on how to educate the staff around the process of perimenopause, the actual menopause and beyond. So you might want to look at a really good foundation session here where you perhaps focus on medical support, what complementary support is available, and lifestyle changes that can be implemented. Then we move on to what I call the nice to have part. So you can build from your essentials and look at other subjects which impact on the menopause. Just as a small example, so for example, things like bone health or nutrition, or perhaps coping with the menopause after breast cancer, sleep impact, and conversations around talking about the menopause at work. And then we move into what I call toolkit building or something different. First of all, looking at follow-up resources. So really thinking about embedding the learning from any sessions that you put on by putting content onto either intranet sites or setting up internal resource pages, etc. I'll touch on gifting here as well, because this is a really good idea to include into your programs. So from a simple goodie bag to a luxury menopause wellbeing tin, these always land really well in my experience. So I'll just give you an example of items you could perhaps think about including. A magnesium sleep spray or a magnesium oil. Magnesium will help with a number of menopause symptoms, but it can also support bone health and relieve muscle tension, as well as promoting better sleep. Vitamin D spray, that can help with bone health and osteoporosis prevention. And pelvic health information, and perhaps a leaflet on some exercises that can be done. So you encourage ladies to look after their own self-care outside of what you're putting on. Or something nice like a self-warming eye patch to promote relaxation and support with sleep issues. The messaging of gifting is impactful, and it also plays another really important role because you can link the messaging you put in your gifts directly to session content. But you can also use it as a way to give staff permission to take care of themselves. And I feel that you're subtly recognising that what they're going through in this life transition is important, and you're supporting them with words and items to enable them to focus on self-care. Gifting can also, in my experience, be used as a very persuasive tool to get staff to attend sessions. So for example, come along and attend our session on sleep during the menopause and receive your programme gift. So you don't have to spend a lot on this, but it is impactful. And signposting valuable resources, again, I mentioned earlier, this can really assist your journey in becoming a menopause-friendly employer, or even in just developing your ongoing campaign. So think about how to always take it to the next level, build from your essentials and your nice to have elements. Next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. So here is an example of a programme that we have run with a health and care workforce, which ran from March to September. And it included 5 remote webinars in a variety of topics. We ran a self-care session for the menopause, which was focused around reflexology techniques and a focus around musculoskeletal issues. That was a very, very practical session and gave ladies tools and tips that they could carry on working with at home. We looked at how to care for you during the menopause, where we focused on lifestyle, medical, complementary, nutritional aspects. And we looked at Let's Talk About the Menopause at Work, so how to have those supportive conversations. This was a session that was run both for managers and employees, so we covered everything and lots of discussion time at the end. We did a session on coping with the menopause after breast cancer, found that this is an area that is hugely impacting many women. So a very practical session on tools and tips to support with that. And finally, what is brain fog and what can I do about it? This is an area that hugely impacts women, particularly those who are in challenging roles. So in this programme, you can see that there's kind of something for everybody. It forms a really nice foundation on which to build. It's also quite simple, so it's not too overwhelming for staff. And this programme was complemented by a monthly support group. So this group also had their own closed Facebook page, so we encouraged them to carry on that peer support element between them outside of sessions that we were running. And we also set up a resources page, though this was a central site for staff who had access to videos, podcasts, webinar content, worksheets, and also internal and external signposting information. And we also included a gift. We did a gift for those attending the programme, but we also created an opportunity for staff to enter a prize draw for a higher end menopause related gift. Next slide, please, Helen. But, you know, not everything has to cost a lot of money. So I thought it was important to look at some ideas that you can do for no cost. And in summary, I've grouped these into 5 areas, my top tips. First one is to set up peer support group. Angela referenced this earlier, and this usually only involves a little bit of time for setup and no cost at all really, apart from time away from the job. So you could call it something different. We often use Wise Women sessions, and that lands quite well. As Angela talked in quite a bit of detail about today, I think this is a really important area, is to look at having menopause champions in the workplace who can help facilitate any groups you set up, but also other sessions or support that you're running. 3, just give time, create a space in the month and show some free resources. You could put a video on about the menopause, something that's topical in the news, or you could do an online yoga sequence and get ladies together to join in that way. 4, cuppa and a chat. You know, remember it costs absolutely nothing apart from a bit of time to set up a really informal chat over a cuppa, and I think those conversations can be really vital and important for ladies. And remember to link menopause to other things. So you could link it to other wellbeing initiatives you are running. You could look at family support, women's health initiatives, World Menopause Day, etc. Next slide, please, Helen. Thank you. So I'd like to now look at other considerations, because there are some aspects of implementing menopause programs that are often missed. So this is probably one of the most important slides in my section today in terms of takeaways. So firstly, think about your demographics. Always tailor your program to suit those who will be attending. I'll give you an example, and we have client permission to mention this, but we do a lot of work with the NHS. And we know that it's really challenging for carers to take time out to attend either remote sessions or on-site support sessions. So we worked in a different way with that group, and we created a resources page for each of the carer groups. So we looked at things like short videos and worksheets, really easy to follow information that was included in there. So that way, if you do something like this and you know people can't come to one of your sessions, you can still allow them to focus on their self-care in their own time and still feel part of the program that you're running. So really think about tailoring content. For example, if your audience are in roles where it'd be really difficult to take an hour out of work to attend a session, make your sessions bite-size. Finding different ways to really put that support in is so important, and don't rely on people navigating information sheets or leaflets. Make things bespoke to demographics and presenting issues. 2, have a backup plan. If you are running on-site support, have a backup plan for remote sessions so that sessions are not cancelled. We all know COVID is still causing some disruption, so always be prepared to offer an alternative, because in my experience, those sessions might actually be a lifeline to somebody. 3, consider your BAME communities. Many of you may already know this, but there is actually no word for the menopause in Urdu. So this presents real challenge around discussing the menopause when there's no actual word, which leads me to my next point. Perhaps think about calling your menopause program something else, particularly if you do have a lot of staff from BAME communities. 5, look at targeting a wider age audience. Angela touched on this age bracket that can span 10 years sometimes earlier in the webinar. So don't only run programs for ladies who you think may be menopausal. Think about ladies in their late 20s or early 30s who may want to support their mum or other family member. Think about including same-sex partners in order to be as inclusive as possible. For example, a younger female in a same-sex relationship will not yet have reached the stage, and she could easily more support her older female partner if she's supported herself and has access to good information. And think about ladies in their late 30s and early 40s who are perimenopausal. And also think about ladies beyond the menopause. We have a lot of ladies who are in their early 60s who attend our support groups because they're actually still experiencing symptoms, even though they've officially gone through the menopause. Consider your working environment, again, something Angela touched on earlier, but think about on-site assessments to support women with things like rest areas, heat, light, and also sound sensitivity. And please don't forget the men in your workforce. In my experience, men not supporting female ladies, female managers really in the workplace comes from a lack of training on how to have supportive conversations in the workplace. So often they'll be silent and they don't act, or they may act in a way which could be seen as unsupportive, really because they don't have the tools to manage this well. So including husbands and male managers, etc., will increase the wider support to ladies going through this process. Try not to be a medic through your programs, and always encourage ladies to seek medical advice and to talk to their GPs or other support, especially if their symptoms are particularly overwhelming. But if you do want to offer actual medical support, I've heard of many organisations who are running initiatives which focus on GP support in the workplace with much success. Now, in the first webinar, peer support was referenced, and it's been talked about in this webinar again, and I'd like to just really reiterate the importance of peer support. Facilitated space where ladies can talk about the menopause in a very safe, a very non-judgmental and understanding way is so impactful. And this is something that can live on in your organisation, as these groups often run themselves post-programme. And you can complement them with time in the day to attend, and perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, a closed Facebook page to encourage continued self-care and support. And finally, buy in the support of leaders in your organisation. Always such an obvious point, but one that's often overlooked, but it's so important. If you can create a genuine culture in the workplace for menopause support, this will go a long way to giving more impact to any of the programmes that you implement. So this concludes my part. I hope that these ideas go some way to you finding a starting point to being menopause friendly in terms of implementing support programmes to staff.